Welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Ask Historians Podcast. Today we have on Dr. Mitch Maki, who's here to talk about a number of topics relating to the Japanese-American experience, particularly in the 20th century. Welcome. Can you tell us a bit about yourself before we start?
Thank you, Jeremy. As you mentioned, my name's Mitch Maki. I'm a third-generation Japanese-American, and what that means in the way that we count generations is that my grandparents were immigrants to the United States around the turn of 1900s. My parents were born in the territory of Hawaii, and it wasn't a state at that point. It later became a state. And I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, on the continental United States. And so I've spent most of my life working in academia and now as the executive director of a nonprofit organization that tells the story of World War II and the role that the Japanese American soldiers played during that time. But throughout my life, I've had an interest in the Japanese American experience because it's the community I grew up in, and I, of course, know so many people in that community. And I was fortunate enough to co-author a book called Achieving the Impossible Dream, How Japanese Americans Obtained Redress. And that was a case study of what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, the incarceration based solely on race, and then 40 some odd years later to receive an apology and monetary reparations from the United States federal government.
One thing that is rather interesting about the redress is that from what you've just described, the timeline seems to put the culmination in the 1980s, which seems to suggest that the process had been going on before. How significant and how large was the push to get redress in the immediate post-war period, and how much does it come, I suppose, in conjunction with the wider civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s?
Right. I think the answer to that question depends on how you define the push for redress. There were some people who came out of the camps thinking that we needed to fight for an apology. They were in the vast minority. The average Japanese American family coming out of the camps were worrying about day-to-day issues like putting a roof over your head, putting food on the table, getting the kids back to school, and rebuilding community. And the redress movement really didn't start to take off as a community-wide movement until the 1960s and then really into the 1970s. And it was a result of a lot of the changes that were happening in the American landscape. For example, in the 1960s, the civil rights movement was in full bloom. The anti-war movement was taking off, where young people especially started to learn how to say, hell no, we won't go, type of thing. The women's movement was also raging in the 60s, and young people really began to question, what does equality mean, and how does it affect not only women in the genders, but also different ethnicities and races and backgrounds. And of course, the ethnic studies movement started to take off in the 60s, where young people of color, and especially in this case, young Asian Americans, Japanese Americans in particular, asked what happened, because our parents weren't talking about this. I mean, that was a phenomenon that we see in so many atrocities across history, where generations go through something horrific and then do not talk about it, do not pass it on to the subsequent generations. And that's certainly what happened with the Japanese American community. So for a lot of folks who were coming of age in the 60s, they had very little understanding of what had happened during World War II. And I'd like to also add that, of course, this is of interest to me because I'm Japanese American and, I grew up in the community, but I see this not as a great Japanese American story. I really do see this as a great American story. It's the story of racism and discrimination that so many groups in America have faced, but it's also the story of the resilience of an American community, the Japanese American community, to find its courage and find its voice, and to demand from our nation an appropriate apology for violating our constitutional laws and norms. And it's the story of the strength of our nation to reflect back on that time period and say, you know what, you're right, we were wrong, and this should not happen again.
On kind of a related note to that, there is the flip side, because as you mentioned at the very start, your interest was also in the Japanese American military experience. I know from my experience moderating Ask Historians that a lot of people point out the paradox between the simultaneous internment of Japanese Americans on US soil, but also the creation of a Japanese American regiment to fight in Europe. And I'm curious what role that played in the later memory as well. Like, was the presence of a Japanese American military unit kind of similarly memory hold along with internment within the Japanese American community? To what extent was its memory brought back up as well in this period as the Japanese American community is trying to get more recognition and of course redress for the internment?
Right. It played a huge role. It played a huge role in this process. So, for your listeners, why don't we go back and kind of recap the story just to make sure everyone's on the same page? I mean, December 7th, 1941, the imperial nation of Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and it thrusts the United States into World War II. And Japanese Americans immediately began to wonder what would happen to us. Would we be treated like the American citizens we were, two-thirds of us had been born and raised either on the continental United States or in the territory of Hawaii? Or would we be treated like the enemy because we shared a common heritage? Well, we received our answer 2 months after Pearl Harbor, when on February 19th, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066, which created the underpinnings by which nearly 120,000 individuals of Japanese ancestry would be forcibly excluded from the continental west coast of the United States and made to live behind barbed wire for the next 3 to 5 years of their lives, right? I mean, it was a tremendous violation of the Constitution because it was based solely on race. There were no formal charges. There were no formal convictions of any sort. Fast forward now about a year into the camp experience, and I'm only hitting the high points, obviously, but the American Army decides that it needs more men, literally more men, to go and fight in the European theater. And because of the success of the 100th Battalion, which had been the Hawaii National Guard that had been put into action, they decide to create a segregated unit of Japanese American soldiers. And if you can imagine what that was like, especially for the families that were behind barbed wire, that they've lost their homes, their communities, their jobs. They've lost everything, including their sense of place at the American table of citizenship. And then their sons are being asked to possibly die fighting for liberty and justice halfway across the world. It was a question that literally tore families apart and tore the community apart. And Jeremy, let me put you on the spot for a second. I'm going to make you a 20-year-old Japanese American living in Manzanar, California, the concentration camp, 1943, and your family has lost everything, and now they're asking you to volunteer to go fight for liberty and justice. And there's a good chance, that you may be wounded or killed. What do you think your response would be?
Not necessarily favourable.
And and that, quite frankly, is the response of many young people your age today. But I've engaged in so many conversations with young folks who say, "There's no way I would go and fight for a country that did this to us." And I remind them that at that time in 1943, America looked at Japanese Americans very differently than they looked at German Americans or Italian Americans. The Nazis and the Italians were evil men with whom we were at war. the Japanese were an evil subhuman species with whom we were at war. We, as a community, the Japanese American community, were not trusted. We were not seen as being capable of being American citizens and contributing to the American good. And the argument back then was, if we don't answer this call, if we don't stand with our nation, because we knew who we were, there was no question in the minds of these young Japanese American men and eventually women that they were American citizens by birth and by loyalty. If we didn't stand up and fight and defend our nation, we would forever be seen as non-Americans, as second-class citizens, as subhuman. And so there was a real understanding that they were fighting not only for themselves, not only for their nation, but for their families and for future generations. You know, and yet at the same time, it meant abandoning their families in the middle of the desert, leaving their mothers and fathers who didn't speak English and who were scared and wanted to keep the families together, having to leave them and saying, I'm going to go and I may die. It was a horrific choice to ask any young American to make. And yet, thousands of young Japanese Americans answered this call, both from Hawaii, where they weren't incarcerated, to the camps. And then they would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history for their size and length of service. I mean, let that sink in just for a second, to think of the most highly decorated unit of their size. And these young men were considered second class. They were imprisoned on the continental United States, considered to be a threat to the United States of America. Um, 8 presidential citations between those that fought in Europe and those that fought and served in the Pacific Theater, 21 medals of honor, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, the medal that you receive when you're wounded or killed. I mean, no reasonable person, including those in the military, could witness their service and question their loyalty. And in fact, they won over a lot of the upper brass in the military, who at first questioned them, didn't want them on their campaigns. But at the end of the war, the 100th and 442nd was being fought over by the commanding generals as to who would get them, to be a part of their campaign. And after the war in 1946, President Truman welcomed them onto the White House lawn, and he said, "You fought not only the enemy, you fought prejudice, and you won." I mean, those were tremendous words to hear from the U.S. president, to these young men for their service. So fast forward now, 40 years later, to get to your question about, did it make a difference in our lobbying for redress? It certainly did. I spoke at length with Senator Dan Inoue, who was a member of the 442nd, and he said it was the actions of the 100th and 442nd, as well as the Military Intelligence Service in the Pacific Theater, that proved beyond any doubt that the Japanese American community was loyal. He literally said to me that I could go up to fellow senators and say, "Look at what they did. What have you done?" And it would be clear that to again, anyone who is willing to look at this through a reasonable lens, that the Japanese American community paid more than its share in the war during World War II.
Yeah, thank you. That's we ranged over a lot of things there, and it's a lot to take in. There are a number of questions that have come out of that. I guess to keep to them one at a time. It's striking to me that you mentioned that actually the camps only existed on the west coast of the continental US, that Hawaii was excluded. And I'm interested in how Japanese Americans in Hawaii interacted with Japanese Americans who were on the continental US, particularly at the time when the camps were in existence, because it seems like a really I don't want to say interesting, but certainly a complicated situation to navigate.
I mean, you put your finger on a very important topic, right? And first of all, let me say that the Japanese Americans in Hawaii, their culture was very different than the Japanese Americans on the continental United States. And anyone who is from the U.S. who've known Japanese Americans from either side would understand what I'm saying right away. There's very little discussion when we talk about this. The Japanese Americans from the continent grew up as a minority. They grew up in small enclaves, and there is no doubt in their mind that it was a white world and that they were surrounded by, and the racism of the time was very apparent. Japanese Americans in Hawaii grew up in a very multicultural setting where, in fact, there were very few white people in comparison. Now, they were all the power brokers and the owners of the plantations, and certainly racism and the hierarchy based on race existed. But just numerically, Japanese Americans were surrounded by many other, especially East Asian cultures, along with the native Hawaiian population. So they grew up in a situation that was much more accepting. And again, there certainly was a hierarchy. There certainly was still racism and so forth, but it was very, very different. They spoke a different type of English, what we call pidgin English, which is an amalgamation of different languages and different sayings that came about from all the other cultures that existed in Hawaii, versus the Japanese Americans on the continental United States tended to speak the King's English, as most of the white Americans would do. When they were first brought together to serve together as a fighting unit, there was tremendous animosity between the two, or they just did not get along well with one another. The Japanese Americans from the mainland were referred to as katonks, and the katonk is the sound that is made when a coconut hits the floor, or the skull of the Japanese American hits the floor after they've been fighting. So it wasn't certainly was not a complimentary term. The Japanese Americans from Hawaii were referred to as pineapples or Buddha heads, and they really would not get along, and there were tremendous fights to the point where the army was considering disbanding this whole experiment. If they couldn't even get along with each other, how are they going to fight with along each other, in the battlefield? And I'll give you a very specific example of how they differed. When they would go to the bars, for example, the Japanese Americans from Hawaii, their style was to each guy would treat everybody else. Drinks on me, and next time it'd be your turn. Drinks on you, and it all averages out. Versus the Japanese Americans from the continent would say, I'll buy mine, you buy yours. So it's a very different way of interacting. And so they just were seen as the Japanese Americans from the continent were seen as standoffish, or what the folks from Hawaii would say, "Hi maka maka," which is like they thought they were better than the guys from the islands, and so forth. One other difference too is that the guys from Hawaii loved to gamble, and many of them had money to gamble because their families were still working in Hawaii, versus many of the guys from the continent couldn't gamble because they didn't have money. Their families were in camp, and for many of them, they would send their money home. Their weekly paycheck or monthly paycheck, they would send it back home rather than gambling it. And in fact, the term "go for broke" is a gambling term, which means go all in, give it your all. And so that's where the term "go for broke" comes from. It's just the gambling habits of the guys from Hawaii. But as I said, they were fighting so often that the Army thought about dismantling the whole project, until finally one day the Army decided the guys were training in Mississippi. There were a couple of camps in Arkansas, concentration camps in Arkansas. They took several busloads of the Hawaii soldiers and took them to the concentration camp in Arkansas. And To hear Senator Inoue tell this story is so moving. He said on the way over, all the guys were laughing and singing, playing their ukuleles. These are all the guys from Hawaii. He said they brought their cologne because they heard they were going to a camp where they're going to be Japanese American girls. So we know where their mind was at. He said as they turned, it was a several hour bus ride, and as they turned the final turn, they saw what looked to them to be this large military installation, and they couldn't understand why it was that there were armed guards at the gates of this installation. And he said it took them only a short time to realize what was going on, that these Japanese American families from the mainland were being incarcerated, that they had lost everything. And yet these families put aside like a week's rations to throw the best party they could for these soldiers from Hawaii. Senator Inoue talked about, they threw a dance and the guys tried to have a good time. But how can you have a good time, he said, when you're realizing what these families have been going through? And I get choked up every time I tell this story, and he said on the way home, on the way back to Mississippi, nobody was laughing, nobody was singing, nobody was playing their ukulele, but they all sat in their buses wondering, would I volunteer for a nation that did this to my family? And it was in that moment that many of them realized what the Katonks, what the mainland Japanese had been going through, because they really didn't know. Because as I mentioned, two separate worlds, two separate cultures. And when they got back to Mississippi, they went back to everybody and said, hey, leave those guys alone. They're the real heroes. They're the ones fighting, even though their families are behind barbed wire. And after that, things started to coalesce, and they became the fighting unit that we know of today.
Yeah, it is a heavy topic. I appreciate, and I don't know that the next question is that much lighter, but the sense I get from the way you've described, the process of being put into camps is that, it's such a profound sense of dislocation that resulted. That the people who were sent there were just completely uprooted, and what kind of routes were put back down afterward? How did people tend to go back to where they had been taken from? Did they try and form new communities elsewhere? Was the move generally back to the West Coast, or did a lot of people head east instead?
It was both. It was both. And it depended on which camp you came out of, what areas you were in. But the camps begin to close between 1945 and 1947. Not everyone could leave right away, but Japanese Americans were given a train ticket and $25 to reestablish their life. So for a family of four, you're talking about $100. You're talking about 4 train tickets. And the question was, where do we go? If we go back to the West Coast, for many of these families, there is nothing to go back to. Their farms have been taken over, their businesses have been taken over. Where the homes that they used to rent were no longer available to them, right? But a good number did still come back to the cities where they had started from: Los Angeles, San Jose, San Francisco, Seattle. But others moved east, as you mentioned, going to enclaves like Chicago and Cleveland, places that would hire. And that was probably one of the main drivers in anyone's decision: is where can I get a job? Will the people in Chicago hire me? Will the people in Cleveland hire me? And there are stories of companies that would hire Japanese Americans, and that's what directed the direction that you would go in. But recreating community was so difficult for many of these families and many of these individuals. And as I mentioned earlier, our priorities were: let's put a roof over our head, let's put food on the table, let's send our kids back to school, let's rebuild community. But there was another very prominent feeling for many Japanese Americans, and that was a feeling of shame. that somehow we had done something wrong to bring this egregious violation upon ourselves. It really is that classic identification with the oppressor. We had done something wrong to deserve this. That we saw this as of our own making, a social misfortune of being Japanese American or Japanese in America in the 1940s, rather than seeing this as the political injustice that it truly was. And so that's why, for many Japanese Americans who are my age and maybe a little bit older, we don't speak Japanese, because our families didn't want us learning Japanese. They wanted us learning the King's English. So let's be 110% American. Let's be so American that this will never happen to us again because we blamed ourselves.
Yeah. And it's kind of on that generational point that I'd like to almost pivot slightly, because it's not often on Ask Historians that we have a guest on who's not just looking at specifically the academic side of history, but also really engaged with public history engagement. And being that that's what our platform is mostly about, it would be remiss not to really delve into that as well. As sort of the introduction to this part, what specifically do you work with in terms of public history engagement?
At Go for Broke National Education Center, we tell this story, right? And it's an 80-year-old story now. And as rich as it is, if it's simply a story of guns, battles, and bullets, then people don't, unless you're a military history buff or somebody who's in the military, most people only need to hear it once or twice. But if we reposition this story as this really is a story of the go for broke spirit, of going all in to fighting for what you believe in. And we argue that the Japanese American soldiers really were fighting to demonstrate the wisdom of America's promise. And that's the promise that in our nation, no one is to be judged by the color of their skin, the nation of their origin, or the faith that they choose to keep. And when you think about it, these young Japanese Americans, they struck out on all three of those, if you will, right? The color of their skin was not white. They came from the nation with which we were at war. We were at war with Japan, and their parents were immigrants from Japan. And many of them were Buddhist at that time. So at that time, the U.S. Army didn't even have an insignia for Buddhism for their headstones when they were killed. But it's the story of the sons and daughters of immigrants. And America is a nation of immigrants, right? That it is the story of the sons and daughters of immigrants who demonstrated in one generation that Americanism is about the content of your character and your belief in the promise of America. So that's how we teach the story. That's how we engage young people today to say, how do we take that go for broke spirit and apply it to contemporary issues today in America as well as around the world? And, there's no shortage of issues that we can apply this to at this point as we're facing a lot of conflict and a lot of challenges in our own nation as well as around the world.
And do you find, in terms of whom you're talking to, I assume obviously it's not just Japanese Americans or Asian Americans that you're trying to talk to all sorts of communities. Do you find that there's a difference in reception across communities, or is the response actually somewhat even across the board?
How do I answer that? I am always touched deeply by how receptive different communities are to this story, and the story resonates with them for different reasons. In the African American community, they certainly have had a long history of facing racism, discrimination, and oppression. And when they hear the story of the camps, that resonates with them. When they hear the story of the segregated military units. That resonates with them, with the Tuskegee Airmen and the Buffalo Soldiers. So again, I'm painting it with a broad brush, but there are many parallels between our story and the African American experience. Latinos in America really resonate with this story because for many of them, they are the children of immigrants or the grandchildren of immigrants, and they see their own experiences in their own way, obviously, in the experiences of the Japanese American community and what we went through. We recently, I was talking with a young Latino who was involved with our programming, and she said, "These men were the sons of immigrants. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. If they could do great things, I can do great things." So again, there's this connection. For most Americans, they get it that this was a violation of the Constitution. And even Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, who passed, but who was a very conservative Supreme Court justice, said that what happened to the Japanese Americans was wrong, but you're kidding yourself if you think it will never happen again. In times of war, the laws fall silent. And that's a very chilling reminder for any of us who believe in our Constitution in America and believe in the fact that America is a land of law, a nation of laws. And it is a reminder that we have to be vigilant to protect our laws and to uphold our laws and not make our laws relative to the situation. So, in answer to your question, Jeremy, there is tremendous there's a tremendous response and understanding, and it resonates with people from vastly different backgrounds.
There's maybe a heavy note to end on, which
Mm-hmm.
I guess has been very heavy already, but
Yeah, let's go for it.
The old saying is, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. I mean, the question kind of becomes: is the only difference if you do study history that you notice while it's happening? Do you think the cycle is kind of doomed to repeat, or through, among other things, the Go for Broke Center and other forms of public history engagement, we may eventually kind of break the cycle?
I cling to the belief that we can break the cycle. I mean, if I didn't cling to that belief, then what am I doing what I do, type of thing. But your point and your question are incredibly important. After 9/11 here in the United States, there were calls from politicians, from community leaders, to imprison all Muslim Americans, all Middle Eastern Americans, because of the hysteria that was taking grip of our nation. We were fortunate at that moment to have, as Secretary of Transportation, Norman Mineta. And Norman Mineta had been a congressman, and as a 10-year-old boy, had been imprisoned at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. And he sat in President Bush's cabinet and was a constant visual reminder to everyone on that cabinet about how America had failed during World War II in terms of its treatment of Japanese Americans. President Bush was keenly aware of Norm's background and said to his cabinet, "We are not going to do to Muslim Americans what we had done to Norm's family." Vice President Cheney at that time, another staunch conservative, also understood how wrong the incarceration of Japanese Americans was during World War II. But now that's 20 years ago. Even today in Joe Biden's administration, there's nobody from World War II. There's no one who can say, "I was in a camp." There's no one who can say, "I fought in World War II and I remember that firsthand." So now we're living off of historical understanding and historical knowledge based on what we can pass on to others. So it makes our work, the work that we do at Go for Broke National Education Center, the work that you do with your podcast, it makes it that much more critical that we put it out there. And we hope and we believe that if we can't at least change the course of history, we can at least alter it enough that we don't repeat the same mistakes.
Well, thank you so very much for coming on. I feel like that's a really good note to round us off on.
I'm pleased to come on, and Jeremy, I enjoyed the time with you. And if there's ever a time you think it's appropriate for me to come back on, please reach out. Be happy to do so.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.